Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new contents.
James was a cautious man. Since the other party dared to play so openly, they must have something up their sleeve. James could only conclude that for some reason they weren't afraid of him calling the police. In fact, from the way the game had begun, they were clearly repeat offenders. James even speculated that they'd somehow managed to elude the hotel's surveillance cameras. After all, since it was a serious game they were playing, they would have been careful to not get caught on video. James decided that right now the most important thing wasn't to call the police, or to even think about that, but to first thoroughly understand the rules of the game. Before he could completely grasp the other party's intentions, he needed to ensure that he didn't provoke them as much as possible, because if James wasn't able to abide by the rules of the game, they might stop him from playing. This was a difficult problem that he'd never encountered before. James fell into deep thought. His ringing phone startled him. Seeing it was Krista, he picked up right away. As soon as they were connected, Krista anxiously asked, "What's going on up there?" James tried to restrain himself, but his tone was still heavy. There might be some trouble. Cindy has been kidnapped. I'm sorry, Krista, I don't think I will be able to take you back home anytime soon. I will have to take care of matters here first. James, I'm on my way. Krista hung up without waiting for James to respond. Clark and the elderly Professor West led their team into the room. Professor West asked, "James, how's Cindy?" Even as he said it, the professor saw that Cindy wasn't in the room. His brows tightened and his expression turned worried. He said, "James, I've already asked everyone on the team. No one has seen Cindy and she hasn't called us for help." Before James could respond, Clark added, "None of us." The men and women of the team all nodded their heads in agreement with Clark and the professor. Then everyone's gaze turned to James, as if waiting for him to provide answers. James held up his hands to signal everyone to calm down. "Okay, let's not get too excited. It's important that we remain calm, especially with what I'm about to tell you." James handed the card with the bad image on it to the professor and said, "Professor West, I think Cindy was kidnapped." Although James had tried to get them mentally prepared, everyone was still shocked by his words. They all spoke at once. "What? What did you say? Cindy was kidnapped? This is impossible, right?" Even Professor West, usually cool and collected, nearly dropped his glasses. When he took the card from James, his hands were trembling. The professor and Cindy's father were best friends. When Cindy left the country, her father told him to take good care of his daughter. Now she'd actually been kidnapped. If this was back home, he could make use of his connections, but here he didn't have any resources. Really, what could he even do? After reading the card, he felt even more befuddled. All the wisdom he'd gained in his life seemed to suddenly fade away. He felt instantly deflated. Clark grabbed the card from Professor West's hand and quickly showed it to his teammates. When they saw the bad image and what was written on the card, they were stunned. Professor West tried to regain his composure. After all, he was still their professor. After a moment, he felt back in control. He said to Clark, "Quickly now, call the police." Okay, Clark hurriedly nodded. Clark pulled his phone from his pocket and James stopped him by saying, "Wait a minute." Everyone was looking at James. Clark turned around and asked, "James, what is it?" James quickly waved his hand and said, "No, we absolutely cannot call the police." "Why?" several people asked in unison. Everyone looked stunned, including Professor West. Everyone felt that there was a life at stake here. If they called the police now, maybe Cindy could still be saved and returned to safety. James didn't feel that he had time to explain everything to them. Looking into their puzzled eyes, he quickly said, "Professor West, this matter might be far more complicated than you realize. We can't blindly call the police right now before we figure out the rules of the game. That might anger the other party and lead to a fight." Being a clever person, Professor West immediately understood James and what was at stake. "Yes," agreed the professor. After all, this was London, not New York. James considered for a moment until an idea formed in his mind. He looked at Professor West and said, "Professor, believe me, I'll definitely get Cindy back safely." Professor West looked into James's intense eyes and nodded, saying, "I believe you." The professor didn't know much about James, other than that James had created an opportunity for himself at the University of Swordbridge. But he'd killed the champion of the World Memory Tournament, Lewis, and caused him to lose his armor. And he'd just invited them to a grand banquet. However, this young man, who looked to only be in his mid-20s, revealed a calm, ocean-like temperament, which seemed to put people at ease. Bam, bam, bam. A knock on the hotel room doorframe interrupted everyone's thoughts. The continuous noise in room 3912 and the earlier sounds of James knocking on and then kicking in the door had annoyed the guests in the next room, who'd apparently called the front desk to complain. A female hotel manager stood in the doorway, with several security guards standing behind her. "Greetings, guests," the woman politely said. "We've received a complaint from another guest on this floor. He said that your conversation is quite loud and is keeping them awake. Apologies, but would you be so kind as to keep your voices down?" James had to admire the manager's graciousness and good looks. This truly was a five-star hotel. If these had been ordinary circumstances, nobody would have taken offense to her polite warning. Unfortunately, she'd picked the wrong time, and James wasn't persuaded by her curvy figure and lovely appearance in the least. A human being had just disappeared from a five-star international hotel, just like that. What kind of security does this hotel have anyway? James thought angrily. He glared at the manager and squeezed out two words from between clenched teeth. "Get out." The woman was seriously taken aback by James's fierce look and attitude. As the assistant manager of a five-star hotel, she was confident in her ability to smooth things over between guests. She had no idea what had made James so angry. Not wanting to escalate the situation, she turned on her heels to head back out to the hallway. One of the hotel security guards rushed up to her. He was a tall and sturdy-looking man in his 30s. He looked at her and asked with concern, "Alyssa, what's wrong? Did you run into trouble?" Before Alyssa could reply, James's roar was heard again. "Get out!" This time, even Clark and Professor West were shocked by James's fury. Clearly, he was worried about Cindy's safety. His eyes had turned blood red. His roar was like that of a wild beast. "Hey," the security guard said, locking eyes with James. The guard scoffed at James in obvious contempt. "Sir, don't you think you should behave more gentlemanly toward this lady?" As he spoke, he stretched his thick arms and continued into the room. The guard's bulging muscles were clearly outlined beneath his uniform. He looked to be extraordinarily strong. As he passed into the room, his frame filled the entire doorway. He cracked his knuckles ominously. Everyone in the room felt threatened, and they retreated behind James. The guard continued towards James, having no idea what he was really up against. Bam! Before the guard even realized what was happening, James lifted the man's huge body off the floor and kicked him out of the room. The guard slammed heavily against the opposite wall in the corridor and fell to the ground. His face was full of pain, and he curled up on the carpet. He struggled to get up, but fainted instead. Everyone was dead silent, as if someone had pressed the pause button. Standing by the doorway, Alyssa had a look of fear in her eyes. Professor West and Clark both opened their mouths to speak, but were unable to utter a single word. The other two hotel security guards in the corridor recovered from their shock. The taller of the two guards pointed at James and stammered, How did you do that?" The guard who'd been kicked out of the room by James was the leader of the security team. It was rumored that the guard was a retired mercenary. In their security team training sessions, the guard had proven to be an excellent fighter. So although he'd only been at the hotel for a short time, he'd moved up the ranks very quickly. Witnessing such a strong fighter get knocked out by the seemingly not very strong young man in front of them, how could the other security guards not be stunned? James sneered and disdainfully said, "You're worthless. What good are you?" The two security guards were completely enraged by James's words. They didn't care how powerful this hotel guest might be. Both guards pulled out their tasers and charged forward. The high-voltage tasers in their hands emitted crackling sounds. Once the shock hit James, he would fall on the spot. Professor West and the others were so frightened that they retreated farther back in the room. Professor West shouted, "James, be careful!" All the members on Professor West's team were academics. They'd never seen such a terrifying confrontation. Seeing the guards advancing with their tasers, people went weak in the knees. For James, this was no big deal. He stood his ground against the impending attack. In a flash so fast that his movements were nearly imperceptible, James struck both guards. The two strong guards slammed against each other and their tasers went off. Their bodies trembled violently before they collapsed onto the floor like wet noodles. James casually swooped down and picked up the radio that the first security guard had been holding. He shoved the radio at Alyssa, who was still standing, scared silly at the door. Coldly, James said, "Quick, call the general manager and tell them to get up here immediately." Alyssa was at a loss for words, but seeing the fierceness in James's eyes, she quickly took the radio from his hand. James strode into the corridor. Seeing the other hotel guests crowding around to watch the show, James angrily shouted, "What are you looking at? You might as well hide in your rooms and make more calls to complain about me." Everyone instantly scattered back into their own rooms. The elevator door opened and Krista, Vanessa, and Katie hurriedly rushed out into the corridor. At a glance, they saw James looking furious and the security guards strewn across the floor. The three women rushed around, shouting James's name. None of them had ever seen James looking that ferocious before. When they reached James, all three hugged him at the same time, trying to soothe the savage beast. With the women hugging him, James finally calmed down. Krista softly asked, "James, what on earth happened that made you so angry?" James replied with a hoarse voice, "I think Sydney's been kidnapped." The three of them were stunned, but not entirely surprised. They'd encountered this kind of thing before. They knew that since they couldn't help, they shouldn't cause any other trouble for James. The elevator door opened again and out walked a beautiful blonde woman wearing stiletto heels. Emerging from the elevator behind her was a group of young men dressed in suits. The men looked strong and strode confidently into the corridor. James took one look at them and could tell that they were highly trained. These were not security guards. They were clearly the woman's bodyguards. The woman had a strong presence. She walked up to the unconscious guard and prodded him with the pointed toe of her shoe. Coldly, she said, "Get up." Ouch! The guard instantly woke from the pain in his ribs caused by her sharp shoe. Seeing who had poked him and was standing looking down at him, the guard was instantly frightened and quickly scrambled up. He said, "Yes, ma'am." The woman's attitude towards the guard was ice cold. She didn't seem concerned that he may have been injured. Instead, she coldly asked, "Tell me, who did it?" Without hesitation, the guard pointed at James and said, "Boss, that's the guy." The woman didn't even glance at James. She waved her hand at her bodyguards and said, "Why are you still standing there? Toss him out." Yes, the bodyguards instantly swarmed towards James. James didn't say a word, but Krista, Vanessa, and Katie had a lot to say. They all pointed at the blonde woman and simultaneously shouted at her, "Hey, what do you think you're doing? Who are you? You'd better think this through." The beautiful woman paid no attention to them. Instead, she crossed her arms and watched her bodyguards descending upon James, looking like she was enjoying watching the show. Vanessa angrily stomped her feet up to her and started to say, "You..." James held her back. Then he gently pushed the three women through the doorway and into the hotel room. Smiling coldly, he said, "Since they won't listen to reason now, let's fight first and talk reason later." The bodyguards rushed forward. In an instant, James spun around and sent two of the bodyguards flying. Although these were highly trained fighters, they were no match for James. Along the corridor, a series of solid bangs rang out as James dropped the bodyguards to the floor like sandbags. They didn't even get the chance to defend themselves. James first hit the temple of the last bodyguard standing and instantly knocked him out. The blonde woman looked at all of her bodyguards strewn around the corridor with an expression of utter disbelief. Not a single one of the men had even put up a fight against James. The security guard who'd been the first to be kicked out of the room by James walked up next to the woman, as if he intended to protect his boss. All it took was one glance by James for the man to immediately become terrified. The security guard knelt to the ground, recognizing that he was no match for James, so he might as well go down without another fight. After all, his life was more important than his job. Surveying the scene, the blonde woman was left speechless. She realized then that she had a big problem. Her bodyguards had let her down. Now she was a commander without any troops. A trace of alarm appeared in the woman's eyes. Her previously cool attitude had been replaced with fear. Elisa was standing behind her, and the woman wanted to pull Elisa in front of her to block James, who was marching straight towards her. She never got the chance. James came up close to her face. Tentatively, she said, Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding between us. I think we should talk this through, sir, if you... Before she could finish speaking, James stepped forward and grabbed the collar of her blazer. Grinning, he said, "You scared my women just now." I know, the woman agreed as she was lifted slightly off her feet by James. Then she reminded herself that she was still the general manager of the hotel, and she needed to keep her wits about her. She tried again. Then, sir, can we talk about this? Despite her efforts to remain calm, her entire body began to tremble. James stared down at her and asked, "Talk? With me?" Yes, she vigorously nodded her head. "Are you worth my time?" James asked her with disdain. The woman was stunned. This was the first time she'd met someone as fierce and unpredictable as James. She found it difficult to keep up with him, so she didn't utter another word. James released her collar and gave her a cold, dismissive look. He said, "You'll answer whatever I ask you. If you tell me anything but the truth, trust me, I'll make you regret it." "Yes, understood." She hurriedly nodded her head, looking slightly terrified. There was no longer any trace of her previous aloofness. James demanded, "Who are you?" She quickly answered, "Sir, I'm the general manager of this hotel. My name is Merrill." James asked, "Was what just happened here what you'd intended?" Merrill said, "Sir, I'm very sorry for what happened just now. I know that because of our recklessness, you, sir, had the most terrible experience. To show our sincerest apologies, you and all of your friends will be guests of the hotel free of charge." Everyone in the room was surprised to hear that. James, however, wasn't buying it. Damn, this woman talks but doesn't listen, he thought. He looked coldly at Merrill, whose face was filled with hope that she'd smooth things over. James scoffed at her and frowned, saying, "Did I ask you to apologize?" With that one question, all the lines that Merrill had been prepared to say next became lodged in her throat. She felt as if she might collapse. This person was impossible. James continued glaring at her and said, "Do I look like someone who lacks money? I could buy this hotel with a snap of my fingers." Yes. She could only nod repeatedly, not daring to say anything else. James waved his hand to signal Clark to bring over the mysterious card bearing the image of the bat. After Clark handed it to him, he held it up to show Merrill and asked, "Do you know what this is?" "Oh!" As soon as Merrill saw the card, she gasped and covered her mouth with both hands, looking frightened. Clearly, she knew something. James waited patiently for her to recover from her initial shock. It took several moments for Merrill to get a hold of herself. She looked at James with an intense expression. "Sir, this card represents an underground organization here in London. They're called the Black Bat Society. If you receive this card, you must play a game with them. If you pass each level, they'll let you go. If you fail," she trailed off. Merrill shook her head before continuing. "The truly frightening thing is, rumor has it that no one has ever cleared all levels of their game. So without exception, all those targets are now dead." Merrill looked thoughtfully at James and asked, "Sir, what did you do to provoke them?" James didn't answer her. Instead, he waved his hand dismissively and said, "Okay, take your men and go." Merrill was stunned. She frowned, as if she couldn't believe that he would let her go that easily. She couldn't help but ask, "You're letting us leave, just like that?" James rolled his eyes at her. "What else should I do with you?" She was so scared that she couldn't breathe. James waved his fist and shouted, "Go, before I change my mind! Disappear!" Meryl didn't argue. Quickly retreating back toward the elevator, she kicked her good-for-nothing bodyguards on her way out. After the danger had passed, Krista rushed over to James and asked, "Did you find out something?" Vanessa and Katie also squeezed over and surrounded James. All of the women looked concerned. James nodded gently and said, "Yes." No matter how violent James could be, these three women, each of whom had gone through life and death situations with him, brought out his best and most gentle nature. But right now, he didn't need comfort. He needed information about this underground organization. James knew just the person to ask. He strode out into the hallway, whipped out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and pressed call. The call was picked up at once.
"Hello, James. What can I do for you?"
What nobody in the hotel room besides James knew was that the person on the other end of the line was Dax Freeman, the Dark Abyss assassin, the most feared assassin in the world. "What do you know about the Black Bat Society?" James didn't waste any time getting to the point.
"It's a new outfit operating in London. They play crazy and dangerous games just for the sheer excitement of it."
Dak paused for a moment, as if considering, then continued.
"Why do you ask, James? Did the Black Bat Society challenge you? Do you need me to do something about it? My Dark Abyss colleague, Soul Reaper, happens to be working in London right now. Do you want me to ask him to help you deal with some trouble?"
"No need," James decisively refused. "I've got it handled. But if you can dig up anything else on the Black Bat Society and report back to me as soon as possible, I'd appreciate it, Dax."
"No problem,"
Dax replied. After hanging up the phone, James felt more confident. He had to admit that having the #1 underground assassin for a friend was a good thing. Even though James didn't need his direct help this time, Dax's offer was appreciated. It occurred to James that sometimes assassins were quite loyal, but only if they respected your capabilities. James pocketed the phone and walked back into the room. Everyone's eyes gathered upon him. Obviously, after everything that had just happened, James had become the hero of the group. It was also obvious that they couldn't stay in this hotel any longer. James was about to face an endless series of dangers, so what he needed to do now was find a reliable person to safely shelter everyone. Only then would James be free to try and rescue Cindy and fight to win the serious battles coming up ahead. James could only think of one person in London who might be able to help: Edward, owner of the English pub. James called Edward and quickly explained the situation. Edward immediately agreed to provide safe harbor for the group and assured James that he would take care of everything. Edward drove over and met the group inside the hotel's parking garage. After getting nearly everyone loaded into Edward's supersized SUV, James shook hands with Edward and sincerely thanked him. "Edward, this time, I really owe you." Edward shook his head. "James, you're too kind. Don't forget, you helped me with that situation in the pub, and I haven't even thanked you yet." Edward released James's hand and then patted his own chest, promising, "Don't worry, James. I'll make sure they're safe and sound." Krista, Vanessa, and Katie hadn't climbed into the SUV. They didn't seem to want to leave, and they all surrounded James. They'd sensed the danger he faced and were reluctant to part ways. James said to them, "You should all leave together." Vanessa pouted and said, "James, didn't we agree that we'll never separate again?" James's expression changed instantly, and he said, "I won't discuss it any further. The situation is different now." Vanessa stomped her foot and sniffed defiantly, like a child throwing a temper tantrum. "You always say the situation is different. What's the difference this time? We've already survived stormy seas, haven't we?" James didn't even respond. Krista immediately noticed the change in James. He wasn't messing around. Krista pulled Vanessa aside and said, "Vanessa, let's go. We need to stick with the plan." Krista was smart enough to know that if she couldn't help James, the least she could do was not cause any additional trouble for him. Looking at his serious expression, Kristen knew that the matter at hand was complicated. Still, Vanessa persisted. She was determined to not leave James. James pointed at a security guard by the garage door, then looked at Vanessa and said, "You want to follow me? Okay, see that guard over there? You go over and use your badass fighting skills to put him down. You have 1 minute. If you can do that, then sure, be my guest. Come with me." Vanessa's pretty face turned pale in frustration. She couldn't deny that James was right. If she tagged along, she'd only be a burden to him. So she reluctantly decided to join the others in Edward's SUV. Before she climbed in, she said, "James, be careful." Then, unable to resist him, Vanessa gave him a huge hug. After sending off the group with Edward, James returned to room 3912, Cindy's room. There he waited for Dax Freeman's return call, hoping that his friend would be able to dig up some useful information on the Black Bat Society. Just as James sank down onto the soft bed of the hotel room and was about to lie down and rest, a notification pinged on his phone. James glanced at the message. "The host pays no mind to their own safety as they prepare to rescue fellow citizens of the Great British Empire. It is a noble cause that has triggered a reward, the chance to play the lottery to win a special skill. Does the host want to play the lottery?" Without hesitation, James said, "Draw the lottery immediately." The screen instantly switched to a slot machine interface. The bar quickly rolled, then came to a sudden stop. A voice rang out from the phone. "Congratulations to the host for winning a special racing skill." James was stunned. What did that mean? Could it be that the racing skill was to be demonstrated on the streets at life and death speeds? Damn, isn't that exciting? James thought. As James was considering what it meant, a huge amount of information about race car driving seemed to download into his mind in an instant. He couldn't help but move his hands as if he were steering an imaginary car. James's phone rang, interrupting his train of thought. It was Dax. James picked up and Dax launched right into his findings.
James, I've looked into it and talked with some trusted sources. This Black Bat Society doesn't just want to kill people. They want to torture them just for fun. All they're looking for is excitement. I'm told that once someone is targeted by them, there's no escaping death at their hands. So James, I think you really do need my help. I'm still in Paris. I can rush over to London right away.
James quickly said, "No, Dax. Like I said before, there's no need. I can settle this matter myself." Dax didn't argue, saying,
"Oh, okay then."
After all, he was talking to Lord Hades. Even Dax had to admire him. It seemed as though there weren't many people in the world who could truly pose a threat to him. Before Dax hung up, he said,
"James, you don't have much to worry about. Although this Black Bat Society is ruthless, there is also a very unique characteristic to their gameplay. That is, as long as you're playing the game, your kidnapped friend won't be in any danger. Their whereabouts are unknown. Nobody has been able to discover where they're hiding, but once the game starts, they'll definitely contact you." Got it. Understood. James hung up the phone and laid down on the bed, quietly waiting for the Black Bat Society to make further contact with him. Since it was a game, they had to invite him, a big player. Still, it was hard to say if they could still afford to play. Sure enough, at midnight, James's phone rang again, waking him from a deep slumber. He grabbed the phone and looked at the screen. It was an unknown number. James picked up the call. An unfamiliar voice said, "Listen, if you want to save your friend from now on, do as I say." The voice had a strange quality, as if it were running through a sound-altering filter. Okay, James quickly agreed. He knew that he wouldn't get anywhere without first making the connection. Instead of cursing them over the phone, it would be better to give them his fists when they met in the future. The odd voice continued. "The initial stage of the game is the city race. A car has been prepared for you and it's parked in the circular drive of your hotel. Drive to the first traffic signal west of the hotel. There you will find 2 cars waiting for you. Once you see those cars, As soon as the traffic light changes to green, the game will begin. After a slight pause, the voice added, Your destination is Tower Bridge. Worthy player, I wish you good luck. If you win this round, your friend will be safe and sound. If you lose, we'll give you a beautiful white finger to remember her by as soon as you start the second round. James's heart clenched up, but then he forced himself to breathe deeply and remain calm. Clearly, his opponent was exerting psychological pressure. James needed to stay focused and couldn't let himself be manipulated. James asked, And what exactly would constitute my victory? Don't worry, we have strict standards. It's a game, and we absolutely follow the rules of the game, without question. Abruptly, the line died. Putting down the phone, James let out a heavy sigh. He was uncomfortable being led by the nose like this, and it made him feel an unprecedented pressure. Compared to surviving a desolate island or forest full of danger, James suspected that playing this game with humans was going to be even more dangerous and difficult to navigate. Despite that, he had to admit that the system was pretty awesome. When the special reward had been triggered, he'd won top racing skills. Even though the determination of victory was in the hands of his opponents, and he didn't even know the route the race would take through the city, James was still confident that he could win the first round. It wasn't that he was blindly arrogant, nor did he look down on his opponent. It was simply that he had to win, because if he lost, Cindy would suffer. So there was no other way. After getting up and straightening his clothes, James quickly made his way downstairs. When he exited the lobby, he saw the black Audi R8 parked in front of the hotel. So generous, James thought. With the acquisition of his special driving skills, James's knowledge of cars suddenly rivaled the world's best driver, Schumacher. That was how James instantly knew that the Audi R8 was equipped with a 620 horsepower V10 engine that could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 3 seconds. It was an exceptionally powerful machine. James had to give credit to the people running this game for being generous. To hand James the keys to a sports car worth a couple $100,000 took some courage. That amount of money meant nothing to James, and he figured that anyone who could play at this level must have wealth and power. He thought that they were most likely the sort of rich young men who were bored living their lives of luxury and were in pursuit of some excitement. The thought made James angry, but he quickly suppressed it, climbed into the driver's seat of the Audi. The key was in the ignition. He turned it to start the car, and then took 3 deep breaths. It was critical that he remain calm. James heard Big Ben chiming from some distance away. He glanced around. It was the middle of the night in London, and there was no one out on the street. James drove to the first traffic signal. No one knew how strong the murderous intent in his heart was at that moment. As expected, when he pulled up to the intersection, there were 2 cars waiting for him. On the left side of the road sat a blue Lamborghini. On the right sat a red Ferrari. The Lamborghini SC20 had a 6.5-liter 770 horsepower V12 engine. James was even more familiar with the Ferrari A12, since he'd driven one before. He expected that the Ferrari's performance would be about the same as the Lamborghini's. Both were first-class race cars. Damn! Seeing the 2 race cars, James slapped the steering wheel hard. Bastards! This is what you call fair? No matter how one sliced it, the Audi couldn't compare to the Ferrari or the Lamborghini. They weren't even on the same level. The Audi was a sports car, but the others were race cars. The differences were obvious. James felt that if it wasn't for the fact that he'd obtained the special driving skills, he'd give up right then and there. Suddenly, a person wearing a helmet ran up from the side of the road. He knocked on the window of James's car. When James rolled down the window, the man tossed him a map. James picked it up and saw that it was a map of London. There was a line drawn in red pen indicating the route to the final destination, Tower Bridge. Clearly, this was the map of the game. Although James was glad that things were finally getting underway, his angry mood didn't lift. In fact, at that moment, he felt furious. If it weren't for the fact that the Black Bat Society was still holding Cindy hostage,
James would have flipped over the two race cars, dragged out the drivers, and given them the beatings they deserved. The race cars on either side of James started their engines. James understood that this meant the signal was about to change from red to green. The first round of the game soon began. The man in the helmet was standing at the edge of the road, looking excited. He raised a checkered flag into the air. The two race cars surrounding James kept buzzing like two monsters eager to start the hunt. The man holding the flag shouted, 3, 2, 1. The light turned green and the man lowered the checkered flag, yelling, "Go, go, go!" In an instant, the cars shot forward like steel arrows released from a bow, roaring insanely as they tore through the night air. The Ferrari and Lamborghini both quickly pulled ahead of James in the Audi. James saw the driver in the Lamborghini actually flip him the bird. James wasn't bothered and kept following closely behind them. James knew that the Audi couldn't possibly keep up with the race cars on a straight road such as this, but he also knew that soon he'd be able to outrun those race cars in the 1st and 2nd districts. Downstream along the River Thames, inside an abandoned and dilapidated factory, a golden-haired man wearing a vampire mask was keenly watching the first round of the game on several monitors, showing surveillance footage from multiple CCTV cameras along the route. One screen showed the interaction where the cars had started. The man watched the three cars simultaneously shoot forward. He waved his fist excitedly and said, "Bravo! The game has finally begun." Tucked into a corner on the far side of the cavernous room, a beautiful woman sat tied to a chair. It was Cindy, who'd been kidnapped and brought to the factory. Her mouth was covered with tape, leaving her unable to speak. Other than tying her up, the seemingly deranged men hadn't physically harmed Cindy, at least. Typically, the streets of London after midnight would be quiet and peaceful. Tonight, however, the ear-splitting sounds of the racing cars broke the nighttime silence. James hadn't even been able to get a good look at the other two drivers. They were driving at amazing speeds, burning rubber and leaving trails of smoke in their wake. James floored the accelerator, and the Audi reached a shocking 130 miles per hour. Even at that, the race cars ahead kept pulling further away from him. James had to admit that the other drivers seemed fearless and reckless. Even though it was the middle of the night, London was still a busy city. If they weren't out of their minds, they wouldn't be racing through the city streets like this. They were clearly excellent drivers, which made James feel that they were going to be tough nuts to crack. At the same time, their abilities aroused James's competitive spirit and lit a fire beneath him. Speed and passion, those were the main pursuits of countless men around the world, and James was currently in hot pursuit of both. He suddenly felt that it was a pity that the streets of London were currently so quiet, as there were no crowds to cheer them on. He imagined spectators watching in awe as the three cars raced past them, exclaiming, "What the?" James glanced at the speedometer and saw that he was going nearly 150 miles per hour. He felt perfectly comfortable driving at that speed. In fact, he felt less like he was driving than piloting a small aircraft hovering closely above the ground. The scenery on both sides of the street rushed rapidly backward, turning the city into an abstract landscape worthy of Van Gogh. Keeping the Audi moving at top speed, James started to close the distance between himself and the two cars ahead of him. Inside the ramshackle factory, the man in the vampire mask watched the footage captured by a CCTV camera. The Audi was catching up. Vampire Man laughed out loud in excitement and said, "Interesting." After he stopped laughing, he shouted, "Brothers, sisters, all of you, come in and take a look. This time we've finally got ourselves a real player." Three men and two women, each wearing different masks, came into the room and joined Vampire Man in front of the monitors. With the masks, they looked to be celebrating Halloween, and everyone seemed to be extremely excited about the game currently underway. A woman in a bunny mask tugged the shoulders of Vampire Man and grinned. "What's so interesting?" Vampire Man replied with a smile. "An Audi R8 going 150 in the middle of London. Don't you find that interesting?" As soon as he'd said that, cheers erupted around the room. "Woohoo! Awesome!
totally awesome. He's a powerhouse." This was indeed interesting, and the group huddled together in front of the monitors, watching the race unfold. Hearing all the commotion from the far side of the long room, Cindy glanced in their direction. The people in the masks all seemed to be from privileged backgrounds. She'd heard them earlier watching horse racing and placing bets remotely. Some of their wagers were for tens of thousands of euros. That had caused Cindy to fall into a great despair. She couldn't begin to understand what people like that would want with her. Why had they taken her? And what were they trying to accomplish? She guessed that James was trying to rescue her, and that made her more worried for his safety than for her own. She didn't want James to get involved since she was terrified that he could be harmed. After all, James seemed to have grown into an amazing person. His beautiful life had barely just begun. If anything bad happened to him because of her, she'd feel guilty for the rest of her life. But tied up and speechless, what could she even do about it? Clearly, James had been unwittingly sucked into the vortex of the game. For a brief instant, she even considered whether she should end her own life rather than let James continue down this dangerous path. Because in her eyes, this was a game that she wasn't going to win either way. James was still following the two race cars, and the distance between them was rapidly closing. The unrelenting speed made James worried that all four tires were about to catch fire. He could already smell burning rubber. Suddenly, the first bend appeared up ahead. "Here we go," James shouted. The drivers ahead swung the tails of their race cars and smoothly negotiated the first curve. "Whoa!" Both drivers shouted excitedly in their respective cars. Like the people watching in the factory, these two men were also wearing masks. It was quite possible the most beautiful maneuver that each had ever completed in their lives. Their driving was perfect. They were certain that the sharp curve would easily shake off the driver behind them. They were in the oldest part of the city now, and there were many twists and turns in the ancient streets. They figured that by the time they reached Tower Bridge, James wouldn't even be able to catch their dust. "See ya!" shouted the Ferrari driver. Not so fast. In a squeal of burning tires, the two drivers saw the Audi suddenly emerge from a narrow alleyway up ahead and jump onto the road directly in front of their speeding cars. The race car drivers were forced to slam on their brakes, sending both cars into tailspins. James floored the Audi and sped away, flipping the bird to both drivers who were still reeling behind him. The Ferrari and Lamborghini drivers were shocked. A sports car had outmaneuvered two race cars in one move. It felt like a slap in the face, and the previously smug drivers weren't feeling quite so confident now. The Ferrari driver peered down the impossibly narrow alleyway. It didn't look wide enough for two bicycles, let alone the Audi. He whispered in disbelief. How the hell did he pull that off? Racing towards Tower Bridge, James' world-class driving skills were fully on display. After another turn, he lost sight of the Ferrari and Lamborghini, certain now that they wouldn't be able to catch up before he reached the finish line. James was easily the first to arrive at Tower Bridge. He'd completed the first round of the game without any mishaps. After he climbed out of the Audi, his phone rang again, just as the two race cars arrived at the finish line. At the same time, the sound of sirens started up in the distance.